So again, like I said, welcome to our Empowering Young Children and Families Through Active Learning webinar. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box as we'll be addressing them with the instructors at the end of the presentation. Be sure to change your "to" in the box down at the bottom to all panelists and attendees in the chat box so everyone can see your questions. The documents for the webinar can be found in the link that we are putting in the chat box as well. And we'll also be putting a few other links to some other information that the presenters will be talking about later during their presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, APH YouTube channel, and the link is also being copied and pasted into the chat box. And then of course you can always go to aphconnectcenter.org/webinars to view all of our upcoming, our past webinars, recordings, and also to see what's coming up next on our schedule. And we also have a Dropbox link, excuse me, for the PowerPoints and our handouts. And that link is also being copied and pasted into the chat box. So before we move on, let's see who's all here today. I just launched a poll and we want to know, there are 3 questions. We want to know, what is your primary role? Are you an adult consumer, early intervention teacher, O&M, TVI, AT specialist, division rehab specialist, therapist, or teacher, college faculty or state administration, student in a college program, a parent, or other? So please indicate that for us. Also, let's see where you're from. We've got a Northeast US, Southeast US, Northwest US, Southwest US, Midwest US, US territory, Canada, Australia or New Zealand or European country. And we also want to know how you heard about this webinar today. Did you hear about it through the APH Connect Center website, email from APH, university faculty that shared this with you, ACVREP website, a friend or colleague, through social media, or other? And it looks like some people are saying they got it from an email list. So like an email, great. Glad to see you're getting that information one way or another. We have about 75% of the people have voted. We'll wait for a few more. And then I will end the polling and we'll get our final results. All right, I'm gonna end the polling now and let's see who we have. Wow, the majority of our audience members today, we're looking at TVI, O&M specialists, and AT specialists. That's good. We have some EI teachers, some vision rehab, some college faculty, state admins. We have a couple, a student in a college program, a couple. Great to have the parents here. Thank you for coming. And other. We also have, let's see, we've got about 30% of our audience is from the Midwest, which is where I'm situated. And so are Julia and Sarah, we're in Illinois. But then we've got people from Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, we got Canada. We have, wow, 11 from European countries. So that's awesome. I'm glad that we're able to help internationally as well. This is great. And then let's see, how did you hear about this webinar? Looks like our emails from APH are getting out there, friend or colleague. That's awesome. We're getting social media. Great. And our website, ACVREP website. This is awesome. It sounds like we're able to reach a lot of people. So that's, I'm really happy about that. I'm taking pictures of the poll so that we can make sure that we are keeping this data for ourselves. And let's see, we did, what's your primary role? And so we've got that down. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. All right, and I'm gonna, there we go. So I'm going to hand this over to Sarah and Julia. I'll let them introduce themselves because they can do it better than I can. But we're really, really happy to have them and excited to hear the information that they're going to share with us today. So I will turn my camera off and mute myself and hand it over to you guys. Thank you so much.
Hey, hi, I'm Julia Bowman. I'm one half of the Birth to Three team at Illinois School for the Visually Impaired. I've been with ISVI for about 10 years. Prior to that, I was a chemist. So it was a career change for me, but I was inspired by my experiences as a parent of a daughter who has visual impairments and multiple disabilities. And when Mary was born, we lived in Boston. And so we were fortunate enough to take part in the Perkins Infant Toddler program. And that experience was so positive and so powerful that I not only changed careers, but I also focused my entire career on Birth to Three. So I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, I am Sarah Edwards, and I'm the other half of the Birth to Three program at the Illinois School for the Visually Impaired. My story is very similar to Julia's. I was not a teacher for the students of the visually impaired initially. I worked in the actuarial field before becoming a parent. Then I had two children, and they were both diagnosed with Leber's congenital amaurosis, and they have light perception only. So when they were little and were involved in early intervention, it was actually my DTV that kept encouraging me to get in the field and become, a professional working with families. Initially, I kind of resisted the idea, but then when my youngest started the preschool program here locally, I decided to go back to school and become certified so that I could be a teacher working with the families that are just finding out about their children's vision diagnosis. And so I have not regretted that decision. I'm glad that it has happened. And like Julia, I've been with ISVI now for, I think it's been 11 years now. So that is my story, and I will hand it back to Julia so she can get started.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about active learning, and speaking for both Sarah and myself, this is one of our favorite topics because we use active learning with all of our students in Birth to Three in some shape or form. And so we're not only going to talk about what active learning is and how we use it, but why we find it so useful for the Birth to Three population of children with visual impairments. Okay, so we start with Lilli Nielsen. Lilli Nielsen developed this educational approach we know as active learning, and it was based on her dual training in both developmental psychology and early childhood education. She was also inspired by her own personal experience growing up with 4 siblings who had severe visual impairments, and also by her observations of how visual impairment created roadblocks to the development of young children. She's authored numerous publications on the education of students with visual impairment and multiple disabilities, and she's trained educators all over the world. But I believe she's best known for her perceptualizing aids, and the most well-known of these is the Little Room. So in order to understand active learning, we have to take a look at the defining principles. So the first principle looks at how typically developing children learn. Babies have 6 pathways to learning. They're 5 senses plus movement or proprioception. They take all of the information that they gather from these senses, and then they connect it to what they already understand about the world. Babies also learn incidentally, that is by using observation and imitation of caregivers. But since this is a visual process, many of our young children with visual impairments miss out on these learning opportunities, and they may not also be aware of materials that are available to explore, and they're not curious about their environments. And so then this leads to deficits in all area of development. In addition, especially when we're talking about our kids with motor impairments, the world ends at arm's length. So oftentimes children with visual impairments and multiple disabilities are passively stimulated. We hear a lot of hand over hand in early intervention, But Dr. Nielsen teaches us that during active and engaged play, when the child initiates a skill and action, connections happen in the brain and memories are created. And this is what facilitates skill development, but it does not happen with passive stimulation. So in order for an active learning environment or activity to meet Dr. Nielsen's requirements, we need to have the following components. We need active participation for the reason that I just mentioned. For a child to learn a skill, they must be the driver of the activity. We also need repetition. This is how all babies learn a skill. They practice over and over and over. The issue for many children with visual impairments and multiple disabilities is that, say they're playing with a toy and it moves. I'm thinking of a ball, it rolls away from them, and then they can't practice, they can't repeat. So one of the goals of active learning is to give consistent access to materials. We need reinforcement. As humans, we are all driven by motivation. We need to have that reinforcement for our actions in order to motivate us to practice again, to get that repetition. And so we want to give lots of reinforcement in different sensory modes. Limited distractions. Now, I'm not talking about trying to limit the natural distractions that happen in a home environment. We all know that, there's a lot going on in everyone's home, but rather that an active learning environment can create limited distractions just by its design. And we'll take a look at that in more detail later. Finally, and most importantly, we need to have developmentally appropriate experiences. So we need to meet our children and our students where they are developmentally, not their chronological age. Okay. And so when I'm talking about developmentally appropriate, which area am I thinking of? I mean, if I were listening to this talk, I would probably think cognitive was what I was talking about. Let's meet them at their cognitive level, or maybe language, or maybe motor. But according to Dr. Nielsen, we need to think about social and emotional development as that developmental level that we're focusing on. So much of social skills development is visually based. Think about turn taking, facial expressions, gestures, body language. All of that is learned incidentally. And again, many of our children with visual impairments miss out on these learning opportunities. And so even if a child is functioning at near typical in all of the other domains, they will likely be lower in the area of social emotional development. So we want to meet them there at that level. We also need to think about behaviors. So many of our children with multiple disabilities exhibit behaviors that we can misinterpret if we're not thinking about it in the context of their social emotional developmental level. And I just give a couple of examples. At 0 to 2 months developmental level, grabbing or pinching is a request for contact. That's not aggression, but when you see it in a 5-year-old, you might not interpret that as being at a 0 to 2 month developmental level. And again, another example, at a 10-month social emotional developmental level, a child might hit an adult with an object in order to get their attention. This is not aggression. This is appropriate in terms of that developmental level. So no matter what the age of the child is chronologically, we need to think about where they're functioning in terms of social emotional. So in order to address the social and emotional needs of children with visual impairments, Dr. Nielsen created the 5 phases of educational treatment. And in EI, in early intervention, we typically only use the first 3 phases. And the reason for this is that in order to go past phase 3, the child would need to be at a developmental level of 24 months or higher. And that's just in terms of social emotional, not the other domains. So typically we only use these first 3. And so we'll go into them with a little bit more detail. So the first is offering. And I think that offering is the most difficult of all of the phases for us, for parents and for teachers, because it requires us to be patient and to observe. And the main tenet of offering is to make no demands of the child. And this is hard. This is hard as a parent. It's difficult as a teacher, but it's so critical, especially when we're thinking about our little ones who are withdrawn into themselves, the ones who are engaging in self-stimulation, the little ones who don't have a lot of interest in engaging with objects or people in the environment. This is so critical for them. What we are doing though, while we're making no demands of the child, we are taking data. We're learning about their likes and dislikes and their responses to different types of stimuli. And we often rush through this phase or even skip it. But as I mentioned, it's critical. what does this look like? What does offering look like? I have a picture that is taken from a video clip. This is from the Active Learning Space website. And if Melanie could put that link in the chat, the activelearningspace.org. This is a wonderful website. It has just an enormous amount of information about active learning. So I hope you'll all take a look at that. So in this video clip, the teacher, I believe she's an occupational therapist, is sitting behind her student. Thank you. And she is just holding a toy to where when he moves his little hand, he might encounter it. And I think this in the picture, it's actually the second toy she tried with him. The first toy he didn't have a lot of interest in. The second toy had vibration to it. And so he could hear it. You could kind of tell by his body language, he could hear it. He knew it was there. And eventually he does accidentally encounter it. And then his body gets still and he processes that. And then he does it again. And so she's making no demands. She's just sitting there and giving him access to the toy. She's also making sure that his positioning supports interaction with objects, which is really important. We know if a child is too busy worrying about holding their head up because they don't have the motor control to hold their head up, they can't focus on social interactions. So we're always thinking about positioning as well. And so once a child starts to show those initial interactions with objects, we're ready to move to imitation, which is the next phase. So imitation is not exclusive to active learning. You see it in lots of different types of educational treatments, and especially when you're focusing on social skills, you might see imitation with different children of different abilities who have different disabilities. In imitation, we're simply mirroring the child. And I often coach parents to have two of the exact same toy. So the parent can act on the toy exactly the way the child is acting on the toy. And the goal here is simply to get the child to notice us, to notice that we're doing it. And so they start to understand that their actions have importance, that someone notices. And we're not trying to get them to imitate us yet, but we're building that foundation. So in offering, we're just allowing them to know that they can initiate interaction. And now we're showing them, that they can take that a little further, and we're working towards turn taking. And once we're seeing that the child is noticing us, and if we make a little change to what we're doing, they might really notice. They show us in their body language that they're noticing. We're ready to move on to interaction. And interaction, in interaction, the goal is to establish self-identity. And Dr. Nielsen calls these me to you and you to me games, where we are doing turn taking. I take a part, you take a part. This is my turn, this is your turn. So really emphasizing that we are two separate beings. So you set up the environment for activities that require that kind of turn taking. And I also wanted to mention that for our little ones who have multiple disabilities, maybe motor challenges, we can use partial participation here. And I don't mean that we passively move the child through the activity, but that we give them a piece of the activity that they can do independently. And we allow them to do that. And then we can complete the activity. We help. And so that it's still a cooperative process. Okay, so those components of the 5 phases of educational treatment, they address the social learning piece of active learning. But now let's look at the sensory learning piece. And that is why we look at the perceptualizing aids. This is a very short list of perceptualizing aids. As I mentioned, the Active Learning Space website, they have a much more complete list of perceptualizing aids. And then there's also a fun resource. It's not a new one, but it's one that was new to me. The Ohio Center for Deafblind Education has a Hold Everything, Stay Put, Play Spaces document. Some of you may have already seen it, but if Melanie could put that one in the chat, that was that first link I sent you. It has really fun variations of active learning environments with a lot of household items, which I love. So our list here, these reflect the perceptualizing aids that Sarah and I use most often when we're working in EI, in early intervention. And we'll go through those in more detail. So the little room, this is probably, as I mentioned, what Dr. Nielsen is best known for. There are lots of different ways you can make a little room at Illinois School for the Visually Impaired, we usually make ours with pegboard sides and a plexiglass top. It looks pretty similar to this one. And we suspend items with elastic cord. We do that so that when the child grabs an item, they can bring it all the way to their mouth. You know, they can interact with it however they like. But the important thing to note is that those objects stay where we put them. So then the child can get a sense of spatial awareness, where their body is in space with respect to the objects. It's also, this is the environment that limits distractions just by design. So it's its own little room. It's an enclosed space. It can kind of act as an echo chamber, especially if you slip a resonance board, just basically a big wooden board underneath to give that extra vibration and extra feedback to children. When I first saw this picture of this little room, I thought to myself, this is so busy. There's so much going on. And many of my students, I didn't think that they could handle this type of complexity, but I was wrong. And I'll explain why on the next slide. That in order for a little room to meet Dr. Nielsen's requirements, it needs to be rich. It needs to be filled with items so that any motion provides that feedback. So just thinking, if you don't have, you know, a full little room, then there, you know, the child might move and nothing would happen. And so we're not getting that feedback that we want to provide to as many sensory modes as possible. So we want things that they can put in their mouth. We want different textures. We want things that make sounds, and we want things that are visually appealing. We want them to get that feedback so that they'll want to practice again and again. We need support. I've mentioned this already. The child must be comfortable and supported to be able to interact with objects. So we have to think about positioning often. And finally, variety. And this might seem to contradict what I just said about the items staying consistent, but children habituate to objects and they need to be able to progress to higher level skills. So from time to time, we change up the objects. Sometimes we just change the actual objects a little bit, you know, just to give a little bit of variety from time to time. So dangle bar. Dangle bar is definitely the perceptualizing aid that I use most often. And that's because it's so versatile. It is portable. You can take it apart and put it in the trunk and take it, you know, to grandma's house. It's lightweight. It functions in much the same way as the little room, but it doesn't limit distractions the same way the little room does. You can help by having a black board behind it, the way that's featured in this picture. So that does help with limiting visual distractions, but it's not an enclosed space. It does, as I mentioned, give that consistency with where objects are placed. And it does also allow the child to take their time and reach it at their own pace. The other thing I love about it is that it fits in lots of different home environments. So it's a good fit for many families. So next we have attribute trays. Now the goal of attribute trays is to teach children about categories by letting them compare objects. So why are these two objects the same? What is it about them that makes them belong to that same category? On our left, we have a picture of a brush tray where objects are tied to a pegboard, and all kinds of different brushes, they still represent that same category of brush. And so the child, you know, takes his time exploring these objects without our intervention. We're not teaching them, they're acquiring this skill, which is how Dr. Nielsen believes that children under 48 months developmentally, how they learn. On the right, we have a child reaching into a bowl of different types of balls. So an attribute tray doesn't necessarily need to be a tray. It just needs to be a defined space. I use cookie sheets a lot. But this child, you know, she's reaching into the bowl and she's just taking her time, and eventually she'll have two balls at the same time to compare them and to learn what makes them part of that same category. So here's some more ideas for attribute trays. Most of these items can be found within the home. I basically, you know, I talk to families about what's available, what they think their child might be interested in when we pick, but there are lots of different options for attribute trays. So next we have vests. I include shirts in here. I love to make little t-shirts for my students. And the goal here is to help children whose arms are close to their bodies. They might not be able to extend their arms out, you know, because of spasticity or just other motor impairments that they have. So if their hands are here or they're up at their chest, that's where we put the toys. We put them right where the child can access them. When I make my shirts, my little t-shirts, because I'm not a gifted seamstress, I have found that you can purchase Velcro tape that adheres to fabric. And so just like the vest, I make 3 strips of Velcro tape and then use my sticky Velcro dots and then attach objects that way. And it's been pretty successful. So children are able to just play. They never have to wait for anyone to bring them something. And you can have a variety of objects for them to work on different types of grasps and different skills. On the right, sorry, Sarah, can you go back? On the right, we have a picture of some gloves that this family created. I actually use hand splints if children are already wearing hand splints. And again, with my double sticky Velcro, I can attach items to the hand splints so that they're right there and available for a child to play with. And I really like to take the dominant hand and put an more interesting thing, the most motivating thing I can find on the dominant hand, so then the non-dominant hand might come over and explore. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide now. So boards, there are many different types of boards in active learning. And the one I probably use the most is the scratch board. Dr. Nielsen developed this to work on opening up little hands that are fisted. And so you find a number of different textures, cut them into little squares, and that encourages that scratching or that squeezing kind of movement. And it's been pretty successful for my students that I've introduced these to. And just hearing those little hands working at the scratch board, it's really fun to see. The bottom is also similar to a scratch board. The objects are fastened with elastic on a pegboard, but it's just trying to encourage different types of grasp. So depending on what your student is working on, that's how you would choose your objects to meet that goal. And more boards. The one on the left, you can't see this, but it's on a slant. And those work really nicely for children who have a tray, whether it be a high chair tray or a tray that's a component of their seating system. This board, in this board, all of the objects are affixed with elastic cord. They're tied on. And I find this very useful for my throwers. So I have had, throughout my experience, dozens of students who, when you give them a toy, they will throw it. And you give them a different toy and they will throw it. And it's something that they just need to do. And this is according to Dr. Nielsen. We shouldn't try to dampen this behavior. We should let them do this. But in order to not be chasing their toys all over the room, we can keep them in one place. So the elastic cord allows for that throwing, but then the toys are still predictable, and we still can allow for that repetition. And so then when a child is finished throwing, then they can explore more purposely when they're ready. On the right, we have a board that was designed for a student with CBI. So the black background, the red and yellow, and the shiny. But as I said, it's individualized to each student what that child is working on. Other ideas, you can find all kinds of ideas if you go on different websites, different blogs, on Pinterest. A really simple one is just to put predictable toys in a small, shallow basket. And I'm thinking more of my kiddos who are walking around. You keep it in the same corner of the room where it's predictable, and they know that that's where their toys are to explore when they are ready. I also love to put a baby in a laundry basket, as is pictured at the top right. And this mom really did a great job with the pool noodles for extra support, the links that are going across the center of the laundry basket. It's just perfect. You see how the child is sitting up. I like this particular shape, that rectangle. Not all shapes work as well as this shape does. But what that does is it gives a child a sense of space, like where is my body in space? And they feel really secure. They can feel the sides of the laundry basket. If they should drop one of their toys, it's still going to be in contact with their bodies. You can work on retrieving dropped objects. There's so much you can do with a laundry basket. So I just really enjoy that. And so do my students. Also, you can attach with those same links or rings, you can attach objects to the high chair or stroller. Again, this is just to provide that consistent access. So the child is not waiting for us to bring a toy. If they should drop it off their tray, they can just get it back. And finally, on the bottom, we have a little one playing with a hula hoop that's decorated with lots of different fun textures. And this is for my little ones who are working on that pivot on their belly, so they can pivot around and find new and interesting things to play with. Okay, I wanted to mention We've mentioned positioning a couple of different times, but I wanted to mention prone play as an option for those of you who are working on active learning with your students. So this student in the picture, he's using a support bench. Now, most of my students don't have this, but what they do have, many of my kiddos who are working with a physical therapist have a wedge or a bolster or a small peanut ball or something that would allow them to be in this position. And one of my moms of my families, they created their own bolster by tying together pool noodles with zip ties, and they made their own homemade bolster, and it worked great. So in this position, gravity is helping us again to open up a fisted hand. So we put interesting objects in a tray below the child, and we're hoping that gravity will help with that, working on grasp, working on opening up the hands. But another benefit that I didn't see until I experienced it, it really helps with my little ones whose bodies are very busy. They might have some uncoordinated movements, just associated with their particular neurological condition. But in this position, their bodies are still and their bodies are calm and they're really able to focus and explore. And so it's just a great example of how positioning makes all the difference. And I also wanted to talk about CBI and active learning, especially considering what I said about the little room earlier in the talk. I really, in the past, had the idea that CBI and active learning were not a good match, but I have changed my mind completely about this. And the reason is that we need to think about the whole child. If we are working on vision and removing all of the other sensory stimuli in order to have a simple visual environment, we're losing 5 pathways to learning. So we need to find that balance. Look at the goal for our particular student. We can be working on vision sometimes and working on using the senses at other times. So we don't have to be working on vision all day, every day. In addition, some of our students can tolerate some competing sensory stimuli, and we need to give them a chance to practice that. So an active learning environment is a great way to do that. These are 2 pictures of a little room, and you can see with and without the lights on just how that changes the complexity and how they would be working on different goals in that particular little room. So now I was about ready to hand it over to Sarah, but we can stop for questions if anyone has any questions.
I don't see any questions at this time. Just still putting links in for you guys. Remember, if you need to ask questions, to change your to field to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see. Oh, if a student is mostly interested in bells, can you put that in the little room?
Absolutely. I almost always have something with a bell, whether it's a bell inside a ball or just a little, like a bell you'd find in an ornament, like, anywhere, any kind of bell. There was excellent for a little room.
I've even, just to give another idea, I've even attached, if you take 2 like can lids or cans, and of course, without the, obviously with not sharp edges, and put a bell in between those 2 lids. And so when they bat at that, then they can get some more auditory feedback. I think we should claim, Julia, that not everything is child, like don't leave your child unattended with some of these items.
Yes.
It's definitely,
right.
Especially when we suspend things in the little room, we typically put the elastic or whatever we may be using, within a straw to prevent some wrapping. Again, it's just, not the most child-proof always. So we just have to point that out. Were there additional questions?
Somebody wanted to know if there's such a thing as too many bells.
I haven't found that to be true. You can vary them. You can, like I said, put them inside a ball. I love to put one inside a whisk. I like to do that. You can vary the types of materials. If that child is really motivated to play with the bell, give them different things to work on different motor skills, but include the bell. So I don't think so.
And bells can use, you can find bells with different tones too. And that's important, as we play into their auditory. So some of them are definitely higher and some of them are lower.
You know, that's a good point, Sarah, because like with my hearing impairment, high pitches, I cannot hear. I
Mhm.
mean, like my daughter would be like, "You don't hear that?" I'm like, "No, honey, I don't." Like, because she's like, "It's so loud." I'm like, well, "I don't. That's above what I can hear." And I think that that's a really good point, to look at the audiological and see what pitches that the child can hear most easily. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, I forgot. I didn't even think about that. What a good idea. And also, I think they have whisks that are coated, like the whisk part is actually coated, so like, to be
Oh, yeah.
safe on those on the pans that you can't use
Mhm.
metal on.
Yeah, I have
And that,
silicone whisks. Yeah.
yeah, there you go. That might make a difference too in the way the bell sounds, I would imagine,
Yep.
so
I'm
the
sure.
hitting metal. Yeah, I like that. Let's see. Yeah, the hardest part for me doing any active learning, is that I have to buy all of my own equipment and material out of my own money for every student. Yep. And
I
many
know.
of the materials, consumables, you have to buy it over and over.
Yeah.
Um,
One thing though is that I usually start parents with just a few materials, and I found most of my families will go from there and use things in their own home. That's what we emphasize, that you can fill a little room with things you can just find in your own house. So I get it. You have to you have to buy the PVC pipe. We do that. And little rooms are not cheap to make. But as far as the materials, that can be mostly things that the family has in their home. So maybe that helps a little bit.
we actually have a webinar that you guys did back in the summer, I think, about like how to make materials out of the stuff you have in your house. So, go for, let me see who, Diane Mitchell. For Diane, you go to our APH YouTube channel and the archives and look for that particular webinar, because that might help a little bit, to give yourself and your families ideas about how to use the stuff that they already have in their house, so that you're not having to buy stuff over and over. Because even if it's at the dollar store, it can add up really quickly. Somebody else had Leanne Truss, that her kids like the door stoppers that have the metal coil in them. They do make cool noises.
You do.
Yes.
They do. Um, Somebody else, let's see, Elizabeth, she tells her parents that they certainly need to keep an eye on them, but to please let them learn and play and explore without interruption, unless they call out for reinforcement. Or like, are you there still? I think that's the hardest part for parents, letting their child freely and
Yes.
independently explore. Yeah, I can see that. And then, is there a resource with the social emotional phases elaborated?
Yes, on activelearningspace.org, they go into each of those in detail. And if you're interested, you can even take courses. So there are individual videos on each of them, but you can also take a whole class. It's like a 12-hour course on the principles of active learning that goes through them in detail. So start with that website, activelearningspace.org.
Yeah, that is an awesome website.
Thanks.
Let's see. When considering a little room for a CVI student, how often would you change the objects?
So
It's my understanding novelty is a characteristic of CVI.
it is. Within active learning, there's this process called the dynamic learning circle. And we didn't have time to go into it today because we don't have several hours. But it talks about, you can watch for each individual child. First, they become active and interested in a toy, and then they start exploring it, and then they habituate to a particular object, and then they're ready for new challenges. So you kind of have to go with that process for changing up things in the little room. And it's absolutely true. Kids with CVI see things better that are familiar, but remember, we're not always working on vision. We need them to explore using all of their senses. So you kind of have to balance that.
And not only changing the objects that you use, but also changing the location. So I often talk to my families about, if the red Elmo is always hanging on the right side, sometimes move that over to the left side and really, or the rattle or whatever it may be, to encourage more search, whether it's an auditory search or a tactile search or a visual search.
Yeah, that's a really good idea too. Oh, this is a really good comment. My colleague and I tell parents that the little room gives their child the chance to explore the house. An able-bodied child would open doors and drawers and pull everything out, right? And this is an endorsement for using what's in the parent's home. So there you go. I like that. I just never, I mean, that is exactly what they're doing. It's just that they're not able to do it by going, and making the mess in the kitchen. We're bringing the mess to them. So, which is messes are fun. Let's see. We have engaged a service group like Lions Club to build PVC toy bars for us. So that's a really good idea too. That was from Jerry.
I think we even down in Jacksonville, where ISBI is located, at one point, Julia, wasn't the Cub Scouts, or they reached out to the Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts and had them
They built some
actually
little
make
rooms.
little
Yep.
rooms for us as one of
Yes.
their
Oh, wow.
projects.
That's really cool. As one of their yeah, and they could earn a badge while doing it. That's yeah, that's a
Exactly.
really, really good idea. Some people have put some really cool links to not only active learning space, but like objects to use in the home. There's a YouTube video link there. The simple strategies for the home environment. Sometimes Home Depot will donate materials when they see a picture or have an understanding of what you're making. So,
And
yeah,
they
'cause
will, if not, if anything, they'll cut the PVC pipe to the length you want.
well, that's
always a
true. That's good.
benefit.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
imagine going into, the Home Depot, like, I need to build this little room, and others like, what are
Yeah.
you building here?
Yeah.
They have no clue, but
Yeah.
okay.
But if you have the
Elias.
measurements, they will cut. So
The home
That's good to know.
environment link to the YouTube video, that was the webinar you referenced earlier.
Oh,
If people
okay.
want
Well,
the
thank
direct
you.
link. Mhm.
Gotcha. Okay, so there you go. All right. I think that's all we have so far in the in the chat box. So I'll mute myself so you guys can keep going.
okay, then we will move forward. So Julia obviously did a great job in explaining what active learning is. And she shared some fantastic active learning spaces that we can incorporate. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about lesson planning and how do we plan to make those appropriate learning spaces for our children and for our students. So first, what we need to do is conduct interviews and multiple observations. We need to interview not only the family, but anybody who spends a significant time with the child. And that may be a classroom teacher, daycare worker, any of the specialists or therapists that provide, a service to the child. Does the child have an in-home nurse that's in there, 6 to 8 hours a day? All of these people will have fantastic information that we need to obtain. Excuse me. We also need to conduct multiple observations. And when I say multiple, we need to observe the student in different environments because we all know that the child can demonstrate different behaviors depending on the environment that they are in. So through these interviews and observations, we should be able to identify the child's likes, their dislikes, their strengths. We should also be able to identify which sensory channels are working. They may have some deficits in some sensory channels, and that's important information for us to know. Possibly do they have a hearing loss or do they have some physical challenges that will definitely impact how they can explore or learn. We also want to learn about what experiences or materials may be aversive. What materials do they not like to explore? What kind of shuts them down? Or what experiences have they had that are negative? We do not want to replicate anything that is a negative experience or aversive to them. We only want these learning opportunities to be positive and rewarding. In the lesson planning, as we learn more about the child, we are going to be able to determine which sensory channels they use the most. And again, that's their vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and movement. So by the end of this, we will be able to identify and rank the sensory channels in which they use the most. And we should be able to identify at least the top 3 sensory channels that they use. And how do we do that? That's through those observations and interviews. We are going to identify the behaviors that support which sensory channels they are using. There's a lot of other information that we need to consider that impacts how the children learn. We really need to dive into their medical history. Does the child have a seizure disorder? And if so, do we know what those triggers are? Because we obviously do not want to present any stimuli or create an environment in any way that would trigger any seizure-like activity. So that's something that we need to know. Does the child have brain damage? And if so, where is that brain damage located? Because as we know, brain damage on one side of the brain can obviously present it, with a weakness on the opposite side of the body. So that again impacts how a child may be able to learn and explore in different environments. And through the observations and interviews, we also may be able to identify some CVI-ish like behaviors, the cerebral visual impairment. Maybe the child has not been officially diagnosed, but when we're talking to the family or observing how the child reacts to certain stimuli, we may start having some suspicions. And again, that will impact how they learn and impact how we need to present stimuli and adapt the environment. Also, we need to look at allergies. Again, we're looking at all of their senses. We're wanting the child to use all of their functional sensory channels. So can the child put something safely in their mouth? Should they have items safely in their mouth? You know, is it, are they not supposed to have anything in their mouth, not oral whatsoever? But can they? And if they can have tastings, is there anything that they're allergic to? Are there any scents or smells that they're allergic to? Are there any materials that if it comes in contact with their skin, they'll break out in hives or have an allergic reaction? Because again, those are all items that we want to avoid. As we're planning for the lessons, we're going to observe those actions and behaviors. We're going to learn more about how the child interacts with those objects. And again, this is going to provide more information on those sensory channels and how they use them and which ones they use the most. So when we think about maybe how a child uses their hands when we present stimuli, when you present something, does the child immediately reach out and grab it? Or do they bat at that object? Or do they fist? Because if they fist their hands, they're probably communicating that that may be aversive. They don't want to interact with this particular item. Do they scratch? Julia had mentioned the scratchers. You know, maybe they don't actually explore with their entire palm of their hand, but rather just use their fingertips and kind of run their fingertips across different materials. So do they prefer to scratch? Are they throwers? As Julia mentioned, you know, tying objects down on a board. Are they throwers? So rather than actually hold something in their hands and tactily and visually explore something as they're holding it in their hands and maintaining that hold, do they not hold something, but rather throw it? So this is all relevant information that we need to obtain. What do they do with their feet and their legs when we present stimuli? Do they start moving around and start kicking with their legs? Do they push the items away? Maybe on the other hand, maybe they were really active in kicking their legs and you present something and they become very still. What about their head and their mouth when you present objects? Do they start opening and closing their mouth really rapidly? Do they start making a sucking, you know, noise movement? Or do they become very vocal? Maybe when you presented something, all of a sudden they start babbling or they become very vocal. Or on the other hand, were they very vocal? And then when you presented something, did they become very quiet? Again, this is all critical information. We also need to consider those different smells and those different scents, different touches. You know, how do they react to all of this stimuli? What does their body do? You have to observe their entire body and see how they react to what they like and what they dislike. Their body will communicate that. You know, really what perks them up, what gets them excited, or what shuts them down. In the lesson planning, we also need to make a list of materials. This list of materials will consist of materials that you may want to use with your activities. So you want to consider using multiple objects. You need to have a very large list, a variety of objects. However, those objects should be similar with some, I would say like in groupings. So you want to have similar objects, but slightly different in some features. And again, this list is going to help you determine how the child explores, how the child interacts, and it will help you rank these sensory channels. So here is an example of an abbreviated list of materials, and it is abbreviated. This was adapted from the Texas, or we obtained this list from the Texas School for the Blind. It's an abbreviated list that is out, I think if we don't have the TSBVI website, maybe we should add that as a resource as well. But Dr. Nielsen actually recommended having at least 70 items on this materials list. So as you can see, this is very short, but we don't have enough time to go through 70 items, nor do we have the space. So this will give you a great idea though. So you can put the list of materials down on a column, the far left, and then across the top, you'll have the sensory channels: vision, hearing, touch, taste, smell, and proprioception or movement. And then as you observe the child or learn more about the child, you are going to identify which sensory channel they are using to explore that particular item. So for example, if we look at the very first material listed, this is a burlap bag with beans or rice or coffee beans. This particular student explored the burlap bag with beans or coffee beans with his hearing. So he probably was able to shake the bag and maybe hear the beans rattle around a little bit, explored it through touch, held it in both hands and maybe squeezed and felt the different textures, and smell, probably especially with coffee beans, brought it up to his nose and smelled the coffee beans. So he used hearing, touch, and smell to explore that burlap bag with beans. If we go about halfway down, you can see metal spoons and metal measuring cups. So like I had mentioned before, we want to use similar objects, but with slightly different features. So here's an example: metal spoons and metal measuring cups. This particular student explores the metal spoons and metal measuring cups using his vision because they're shiny, hearing, probably like to clink them around, and touch. So again, explore them using his hands. So this materials list gives you an idea of what sensory channels this student uses while exploring items. And in doing so, we can look at this very briefly and identify this student's top 3 sensory channels. Obviously, the first sensory channel, or the most used sensory channel this student utilizes, is his touch. He tactfully explores every material listed on that we have here. So touch is this child's #1 sensory channel. And then it would be fair to say that vision and hearing is this child's second and third most used senses. So this child in particular uses touch, vision, and hearing. And this is all critical information as we move forward with the lesson planning. Okay, so now we have identified a variety of materials and how the child interacts with those materials. So now we need to identify what skills the child is currently working on. How can you incorporate those materials into an activity that will promote and encourage active learning? So we do need to consider the social emotional development of the child. Julia explained earlier in this webinar how we do not want to look at the chronological age, but rather we need to look at where the child is social and emotionally. How does the child respond to interaction? Because when doing so, we will be able to incorporate appropriate activities for this child depending on how they are interacting. We can also choose objects from an attractive objects list, or you can find your own interesting objects around their home or classroom or wherever you may be. You want to make sure that those objects that are chosen can be used in the child's daily routine. We need these objects to be familiar and we need them to be meaningful. So I want to stop here for a minute because now I'm talking about 2 different lists. So I just got done talking about a list with at least 70 items. That list helps you identify how the child learns, how the child explores using all of their functional senses. So that gives you an idea. Obviously, you should learn of the top 3 sensory channels used. How does that child explore, interact, and learn? The attractive objects list, I believe, should be unique to each child. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. But can there be an overlap of materials from the prior list to this one? Absolutely, there can be an overlap. So don't think that these necessarily need to be 2 distinct separate lists. So here's an example of an attractive objects list. And again, we took this from a Texas School for the Blind article. It was adapted from The Space and Self by Dr. Lilli Nielsen in 1992. And the reason I say that this attractive object should be unique to each student, because we want to make sure that we're starting with what the child likes. We're starting with what the child prefers. And we also want to make sure that those are meaningful objects. So not every student is going to have the same interests or the same preferences. Not every student has the same routines throughout the day or uses the same meaningful objects throughout the day. So every student, I think, should have a unique attractive objects list that we can pull from to incorporate active learning spaces. And I'm not going to go through this list entirely, but this can be found at Texas School for the Blind, or like I said, you can create your own as well. I think the important thing here is to remember to make sure it's something that they're interested in and that it's meaningful. Just because research has showed that learning occurs when those connections are made, only when meaningful or familiar objects are used, as Julia had mentioned earlier. Okay, so now we have an idea of what materials should be used. We should have a very good understanding of how the child interacts with objects, and we should know what sensory channels are being used. So now we're ready to implement the strategies. But while we implement the strategies, I think the most important thing we need to remember is to support the needs and priorities that have been identified by the family. In early intervention, and specifically, the IFSP outcomes are family driven. We have to look at what they want to focus on. What are their priorities or needs at this time? But if you think about that, that can be extremely difficult for them to answer, if not awkward. So we probably, or most of us, have maybe sat in the living room with the family and the entire IFSP team, which could be rather large. Or maybe we're sitting at a table, at a school. I don't know. We're sitting somewhere, large team, lots of people, and the case coordinator directly asks the family, what is your main concern? What is your main priority? We're asking them to identify one area that they want to focus on. And that is so hard when our families want to come back and say, well, my child needs everything. Not one discipline is more important than the other. They need all of you. So they're not ready, or they're not ready to say, well, I only want them to work on physical, or I only want them to work on feeding, when their concerns are their overall development. They want to see progress in all developmental areas. So that's extremely difficult. So as a team, we need to work together, and we can do better about this. We need to remember that too many goals leads to less opportunity to repeat an activity. And if we do not provide opportunity to the children to repeat an activity, then they are less likely to learn how to generalize any skill. So if you think back to where if we're all sitting down and let's say a child has PT, OT, feeding, hearing, vision, speech. What else have I missed out? We've had kids, obviously, that have every single therapist in the home. So those kids could potentially have 7 to 10 goals on their IFSP because every discipline has taken their area and wrote a goal specifically for their discipline. So let's think about that. The child has 7 to 10 goals. We're working on 7 to 10 different goals. Well, everybody's working on their own one. So we're not giving that child enough opportunity to repeat any one activity to master any one of those skills. We have spread them out way too thin, way too thin. They are not going to master or generalize any one skill because the opportunity is not there. We need to remember that each field of development is critical and takes place in learning a new skill. We each have a role in helping the child progress towards a skill. So therefore, we can all share and work towards the same goal. We can all implement strategies to reach a shared IFSP outcome that reflects active learning. So we each take a role in one or two goals and help that child make progress and reflect active learning while doing so. We also need to remember that we should be following the student's lead. They should be leading our instruction through their preferences and strengths, which we should have identified through those observations and interviews. And lastly, when we implement strategies, our role is to provide the most appropriate and motivating learning environment and activities. So we are setting it up for them. We have learned all this information through interviews, through observations. We have a really good idea of what sensory channels they're using. We know what materials they like. So we adapt the environment. We provide the appropriate modifications. We set it up, and then we step back and follow their lead as they become the active participants. They become the active learners rather than passive. So now let's talk just a couple examples of active learning. So the first example, the outcome is to explore objects using vision and touch in combination. So this is a very common outcome that we often see to encourage the child to pair look and touch. To reflect active learning, we and the families can encourage independent play to promote using vision and touch in combination. So I have pictured here a little toddler. She is laying on the floor, and in front of her is a laundry basket with holes, and different textured materials are coming through those holes of the laundry basket. This is encouraging her, motivating her to reach out, to utilize a visually directed reach to pull at those textured materials, pull them through the hole, and then explore those with both hands. So that is a good strategy to work on exploring objects using vision and touch. We can also encourage the child to explore by pairing look and touch through adult-child interactions involving offering and imitation, as Julia had talked to us earlier. So one way we could do this by offering is either sitting next to the child or behind the child, and we provide those preferred items or preferred objects that we've learned about our student, but we offer those to the student, either from sitting next to them or from behind them. Imitation, one way I could implement imitation as I'm working with a child to encourage pairing of look and touch is I could have a bin of different textured materials. My student could be sitting next to me with her own bin of textured materials, and I'm going to model how I explore those items using my vision and touch. I'm going to explore the items in the box tactually and visually on my own. And my student sitting next to me, and hopefully the goal is that they will then imitate that modeled play and begin some independent exploration on their own. Little rooms and texture boards are also really good strategies for this particular outcome. All right, the second lesson example we have, the outcome is increased container play. So working on container play covers many skills. We often have to find ways, though, to make it interesting because sometimes it's not the most exciting goal to work on. for some of our kiddos, but it really does cover so many skills. It encourages a visual and or tactual search for items, depending how we place them around the child's body. It encourages exploration of textured objects, identification or recognition of objects, pairing of look and touch, and release and grasp. So here I have a couple strategies to work towards increased container play. On the left is a picture of a little girl, and she's sitting in her wheelchair. As you can see, there's two buckets, one on each side of her. One is a metal bucket and one is a plastic bucket. Then on her tray, she has a white tray with orange ping pongs. This provides great visual contrast, that orange against the white tray. Ping pongs are great to use because they're a perfect size for small hands. Again, we want our children to be successful. We want it to be a positive experience. So they're not too big, they fit perfectly in her hand when she goes to grab them. It's difficult to see in this picture, but the ping pongs are actually Velcroed to that white tray. So they're not rolling around. Again, we're trying to eliminate any frustration. So when she notices the ball and reaches for it, it's there. It's not moved on her. She doesn't have to chase it around. It's Velcroed to that tray, so she can grab it. Then when she obtains the ping pongs, she can either drop it in the metal bucket or drop it in the plastic bucket. And as she will figure out, depending on which bucket she has dropped that ping pong in, she will obtain a different sound. The picture on the right is of a blue bucket with different textured objects Velcroed to this. This is actually the bucket and materials that I use with a lot of my students. This is very beneficial for students that are not mobile. We need to keep the items close to their body and in reaching distance. And so again, they're not moving. They don't have to necessarily do a search for them. I have Velcroed a blue and yellow bell ball. There's actually a bell inside of that blue and yellow ball, a hair roller, a yellow plastic wheel, and then a smooth, small wooden dowel. And so the idea here is that they can reach out, obtain that object, and then drop it into the blue bucket. The great thing about these two strategies to reach the same outcome, increased container play, is really, we have adapted the environment. So any student, regardless of their needs, can work on this particular outcome. We just have to bring it to them, right? So even if they have physical challenges or reaching challenges, whether, due to equipment or whatever it may be, they can still work on this outcome. We just have to make those appropriate adaptations and bring it to them so that they can participate. All right, so what do families need to know to create opportunities for active learning in the natural environment? Families really know their children best. I mean, we keep saying that over and over. They know their children's likes and their dislikes. They know their children's strengths. Families are so creative. I say it all the time. Families just need to give themselves a pat on the back because they really are creative individuals. I mean, I have gone into so many homes and the families will say, look at what we created this weekend. And they're fabulous. They're great ideas. They are extremely appropriate for their child because they know best. And so I often steal their ideas. I don't steal, I ask for permission, but that's where a lot of our activities come from, is from other families, because they know their routines, they know their child, so they know what is going to work best for them. So how can we help them? We can help them as professionals to understand the developmental level of the child. Like Julia had mentioned before, again, it's not based on their chronological age. It's not based on their cognitive level. We really need to go back to that social, emotional, developmental level. And where are they at as far as, how are they responding to interaction and how are they exploring? So we need to make sure that families understand the developmental level of their child in order to select those appropriate materials and create those appropriate activities. We don't want to have something that's so easy because of course we want our children to work, we want them to make progress, and we have expectations. On the same note, however, we don't want to make it so difficult that our children are not rewarded and it is not a positive experience and they become frustrated. So it's a very fine line, but that is where we can help and work with the families. Also, we want to make sure that they are incorporating activities into their natural family routines. We should not be asking the families to set aside any extra time in their busy, chaotic day. Nothing should feel like homework. They should not feel like they need to set aside 20, 30 minutes to work on a particular activity. All of these activities should be incorporated into their natural family routines. And, you know, their family routines may look different than my family routines, and that's okay. That's just something that we have to learn and discuss and figure out what works best for them. So a couple examples of some active learning activities that you can incorporate into natural family routines is a car ride dingle bar or a Veltex seat cover. Something that can be put together and put in the vehicle. So when they're going to those medical appointments or running errands, the child has the dingle bar or the seat cover with items Velcro to it right there so they can participate in some active learning. While somebody in the house is preparing a meal, I mean, we all eat, so somebody at some points in the kitchen of all of our homes. So while somebody's preparing a meal, the child can be sitting, you know, in the same room in the kitchen at the high chair with maybe a tray of kitchen items like those metal spoons or metal cups, you know, the whisk, different items like that. So again, it's just another opportunity that the child can explore on their own, but it's all incorporated into family routines. As we wrap up, I just wanted to go over a few things to remember as we plan for each of our students. I think many of us, especially when I talk to a lot of colleagues and coworkers, I think many of us are already using the activities that promote active learning. Maybe we didn't know that's what it was called or that's what category it fell under, but I think many of us are already incorporating these ideas, and that's just excellent. What we do need to remember, though, is to follow the student's lead, adapt the environment to meet their needs, and slowly introduce those new materials and activities that are similar but slightly different. Again, you know, we don't want to always use the same items. Again, we, you know, like Julia said, they habituate. We need to change it up at some point. And we need to increase their repertoire. So we start with what they like, we start with what they prefer, and then we can slowly introduce new materials that are very similar, but just slightly different. It's also important to work with the rest of your team and collaborate and help them understand that it's okay for a child to not use their vision all of the time. I know Julia had mentioned this before, and we just want to keep driving it home. It really is okay, because if they have to kind of not use their vision at that particular time, maybe things are too overwhelming and they can't tolerate all the additional stimuli, they're still using their other senses. You know, maybe they're still tactually exploring something, or they're still getting some type of auditory feedback. So they're still using their other senses. So they're still learning and they're still exploring. So it's okay if they are not using their vision at any one particular time. I was going to share a few videos of active learning in action, but we are running out of time, and I want to make sure that we have a few minutes for questions. So either we can put these in the chat, I can put them out when I stop sharing the screen, or you can contact Julia and I afterwards, and we could forward these links to you after the webinar. Here's some resources that we've been shouting out the whole time. I think Melanie has put them all in the chat as we've gone through, like Active Learning Space, CVI Teacher Blog, TSBVI has an active learning page as well. And then I'll just end here. Again, if you have any questions, you can contact Julia or myself. We have our phone numbers or emails. And then I also wanted to point out that ISVI's Birth to 3 program, we also have a calendar of events that has our webinars through ISVI and through APH through almost mid 2021, I think at this point. So we have the topics and the dates for those as well, if anyone is interested. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. We could put our contact information in the chat if somebody didn't get it, excuse me.
There is, hold on a second. Okay, there was a question about how do you know if it's meaningful? And this is from Angie Setlak.
Well, I think when it's meaningful, it's because it's an object that is used on a regular basis during daily routines. So it's something that is familiar to them. It's not new, right? It's familiar because it's, you know, how we talked about like providing opportunities for repetition. So using that object over and over and over, whether it's the same washcloth every time the child's taking a bath or, you know, whatever it may be, that is meaningful to them.
Right. And because it takes place, it's part of a routine, it has a context. So that helps too.
I had to put myself on mute because my dog was getting ready to bark. I was like, oh no, not right now. I think there was just a request to have all the websites that you referred to listed, but I think we've been putting them in the chat, and then of course the participants will have access to your PowerPoint that also has them all there as well. So we won't have to keep listing them in here, but it looks like Melanie just copied and pasted them into the chat as well. So comment from Kim, excellent webinar. Thank you. Of course. Yeah, thank you. You guys always knock this out of the park. So especially with service learning. I mean, you hear my dog, sorry. She's having a fit because there's another dog outside and she does not like when other dogs are on her street. So she's the only one who's supposed to exist in this town here, right? On my street at least. So but anyway, sorry about that. But yes, you guys always, you ladies always do a wonderful job and provide some really important information. You know, active learning is just one of those things where it's, as a teacher, right, it's hard to have all that wait time because we're so used to jumping in, but with active learning you really have to be so patient and you have to let the process go on and you have to wait for the child to, like, you know, let you know, which is totally, we're so used to direct instruction.
Well, usually the child is waiting, but now we are. So
yeah, exactly. It's the opposite, right? Usually they're waiting. That's a good point. But let's see,
I saw it back. I think it got, because Audrey Dixon had asked, do you have tips to get parents involved who are not using anything like active learning or have never asked for home resources? Yeah. You know, fortunately, Julia and I, we are able to loan some materials to get the family started. And I know that, you know, unfortunately not everyone has that. But we are able to provide like little rooms or dangle bars. Like I said, and oftentimes I have found that when I provide those materials and loan them out and the family then realizes like, oh, this works, right? Because they have to see it, or they have to see their child in action. Then many times then they will find a way to create one on their own.
And it doesn't have to be a little room or a dangle bar. So for example, I have this is an envelope, like a file folder. And I just showed this to a family that this is my scratch board that I made, and they made a better one. You know, they saw it, they took a piece of cardboard that was from an old box. and used, the Velcro dots you get from the dollar store, and then they did it. So that was what it took. It doesn't always have to be the big spaces. You could just have a cookie sheet and a bunch of different types of balls. So just think about the different options. I feel like we always hear about the big pieces of equipment, but really I found that we use the smaller ones more often.
Right. I would agree. And even this morning I was on a session, obviously remotely right now, but the child loves bows, and we were just talking about the attribute trays, to get a cookie sheet. And it's, with the holidays, everyone has bows, shiny materials. And so they can make an attribute tray just full of bows today. So that's something very simple and very easy. Like what Julia said, not everything has to be huge. I did recently have a family that was interested in the dangle bar. Oftentimes the dangle bar is a little bit, it's easier. It doesn't take up space. And like Julia had mentioned, you can break it down and kind of slide it behind a couch or underneath a couch if it's not in use. But this particular family, just through pictures, she realized that she could make a mini dangle bar, and it worked perfect for their child. It sat on the tray. So when the child was sitting in his activity chair or high chair at the table, he had his own little mini dangle bar. And that just things like that. I think sometimes if we just show them and how it can be adapted, then
they make it better.
Exactly. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I just want to address a comment in the chat that says, please remember we do this in classrooms. Can I say thank you as a parent of an older child with visual impairments? I've advocated for this for years for my child. Not everyone does, but I'm so glad to hear that you are. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know going into some of the classrooms too here where I serve, I do see a lot of little rooms in a lot of our classrooms. And I do see a lot of active learning taking place, which is, like Julia said, it's fantastic. So we know it does occur, and that's great.
I think the trick sometimes when it's in a classroom is the distractions, trying to minimize them, because you've got announcements coming on, you've got people walking in, and when their kids are involved in that active learning, they really need that focus, right? That lack of not having all the other kids talking or teachers talk, it's like, that's the trick when it's in the school. But I'm glad it does happen for sure. It's just you got to manage that piece of it.
I've been in one classroom here locally that the teacher was able, not saying that everyone can, but the teacher was actually able to kind of isolate a whole corner, and they were able to shut that off, with large curtains. I mean, of course, they could still get some auditory from the rest of the classroom, but they were able to control the lighting in that corner. They were able to just kind of isolate it. It was a bit quieter, and provided everything in there. So that was very good.
Yeah, I mean, control what you can for sure, as much as you can, and that's an excellent workaround for sure when you can't keep everything quiet. But if you like just a curtain in and of itself is like making that barrier, definitely probably muffling some of the sounds a little, if anything. But yeah, you're right. It is definitely good. It can be done in schools as well, not just in the home.
Yeah, I saw in that Hold Everything document from Ohio that we posted the link earlier, they actually use the light box as an active learning space. They have a lot of suction cup toys on the light box. And I know at least one school that they use nap time for kids who are going to do light box work. And that would be a good opportunity to do active learning activities using the light box during a quiet time.
Yep, you're right. That I did. Yep, nap time. Yep, you're right. Yep. That would also be a really good time. If your child is
not napping, it's just, I know it was always my child that never napped. So she was the one that got to do light box time when everyone else napped.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah, mine napped at school, never at home. So that. That was like. But now this was all really, really, really good information. Oh, somebody had a question about what is a dangle bar, please.
You want to explain it this time, Sarah?
Sure. Well, and I could even, I could share the screen. I'll share the screen and go back to it.
It's not made, but I have one in my room here. This one is not decorated. It does have some beads on it, but it's basically PVC pipe. It has feet. It has feet on the bottom. It has elbows. And I use shower curtain rings, as Sarah does too. And I usually suspend items with elastic cord. This one I was in the process of making, so I'm sorry, it's incomplete. That's my project.
And as we talked about before, I don't know if you caught it. Yeah, I like to use elastic because then, you know, as the child reaches, they can bring it towards them. And then unfortunately we don't have it pictured in this image, but I usually put large straws, like I'll go get the milkshake straws, and put the elastic inside those milkshake straws just to provide a little
They don't
more
wrap up in
safety.
the cord.
Mhm. But you could make those, again, that's what I tell families. Like, I think ours typically, Julia, are about 2 to 3 feet by 2 to 3 feet, you know, in height and width. But again, you know, families can adapt that to any size that they want.
Well, and I've seen some families have those little play bars that go over the mats, the play mats, and we just strip them down and make them simple. So take all of the patterned stuff, material that's on them, and take that off, and then just take some of the plushy toys that are hanging on there and replace them with more interesting items. So you don't necessarily need to make a dangle bar. You can take whatever the family has in their home that's similar. And I've seen on Active Learning Space, they put like different bars in between chairs. I mean,
yeah, like a broom. I've seen where like a broom handle and you can dangle things. I've also seen images where you could hang items like underneath their dining room table, or you know, so they have the table, and they could drape, you know, if they want it enclosed, they could drape sheets over that table and have, you know, light or things suspended from underneath the table.
Yeah, there are lots of different ways to achieve that same kind of active learning space.
Yeah, that's really cool to just do it like you have the table there. I like that idea as well. Yep. That, I mean, you can get so creative with this.
I had somebody asked, could you use a play tent? I have had families that use a play tent. That's very common.
And that again limits distractions, right? Because it's its own close environment. That's a great idea.
Oh yeah. Yep. Time limits. Are there any time limits to keep kids in little rooms for any one session at home or classrooms?
I think you need to look at how the child is interacting and when their body language is telling you that they've habituated or they've had enough. Yeah, they're done.
Yeah, I definitely say, you know, tell families I think, you know, I know that I get asked this question quite a bit. There's no really set time limit that I think we can give them. It's just watching your child and seeing if they're tolerant, you know, and how long they're tolerant. And like Julia mentioned, how long are they interactive? And when they quit interacting, then their time's up.
Yeah.
So the dangle bar in the car, the easiest way is if you have the bucket car seat that already has a handle, just hang things from the handle. That's the easiest one. But it's just basically the same as our regular dangle bar. You just make it smaller. You just make, you know, tiny little legs. That would be the same. And you can get all these instructions on activelearningspace.org on how to make the spaces, any of their spaces.
Let's see. You haven't. Oh, you did the dangle bar. I've laid a child on their tummy on a water matter.
On a water
mattress, but
like a water mat that maybe I know sometimes those water mats have like items inside that maybe that's what they're talking about.
Maybe. Yeah.
Well, that would give you a nice sense of body awareness, right?
Right. Yeah. Because
yeah.
You would.
Yep. Water mat. Yep. That Angela said yes. Mat is what she meant. Yep. Yeah, I like that. You're right, because your body's going to be kind of moving around and it's going to wake up muscles that you probably didn't know you had, you know, to make them use it to balance themselves out. So that's a really good one.
So I saw a comment. I should not recommend the car seat bar up while driving. Thank you. So
maybe there's a way you could strap it around the seat, you know, like a large strap that around the seat and this attach it.
I have just seen just ready-made bars go across car seats. I've seen them made, so I'm not sure.
Oh wow, yeah. I don't know. That's
like little play bars. I've seen those on car seats. So.
Definitely something to keep in mind. I didn't realize that the handle could cause more injury. Wow. That's yeah. Okay, thank you for adding that. Yeah, then don't do that. Right. Thank you, Ms. D, for that. Okay, well, it looks like we're at 2:30 and seems like, I mean, you guys have answered all the questions that we've had so far. And of course, if there's any others, people may email you, reach out to you.